Hi, this is Andy Serwin, and thanks for joining us for the next in the series of CyberSide Chats, this one about cyber war, cybercrime, cyber espionage, or cyber vandalism. We've previously looked at a variety of issues regarding cybersecurity, including emerging threats, and talked a little bit about threat actors before, but we'll talk about them today just to sort of tee up the issue of, frankly, what exactly we're dealing with now and what the emerging threats really can be. Drawing some, at times, artificial lines, there are some broad categories for threat actors. You have state-sponsored actors. You have cyber criminals, which may or may not be state-sponsored. You have hacktivists with a little different agenda. Private sector at times, and as well as a variety of others. And this can really vary depending on the nature of the information in play, the nature of the network that's being attacked, or other factors. But the important thing is to recognize that there are broad categories, but at times these do cross over, and it's hard to attribute at times depending on what information you have or don't have. So one term that we're all very familiar with, obviously, is cyber war. That typically is a state-sponsored actor acting in certain ways to engage in what could be considered warlike activities, whether there is a kinetic or physical component to that, or it's simply an attack to degrade the military or intelligence capability of another country. Those types of attacks, again, are much more limited to state-sponsored actors, or at least state-sponsored actors acting through someone else with specified targets that could be, most of the time, public sector, certainly private sector in certain cases if there is a defense contractor, or there are others that really are military or defense capability depends upon in the private sector. Obviously, that could be critical infrastructure, it could be others, but cyber war we do see certainly as a threat with defined actors in that space. Cybercrime is, again, something that people are familiar with, and here, while many of these attacks are cybercrimes, the point here is that there are certainly attacks that are focused on cybercrime, committing identity theft, gathering information to commit crimes. And again, we are familiar with those types of attacks and those types of breaches, and could be related to cyber war, certainly may not be, could be related to other types of attacks, but as a broad category, it's one that is familiar to most people who deal with cybersecurity. Cyber espionage is another category broadly that is, again, familiar to those who deal with cybersecurity. This tends to be focused more on the theft of information about companies or from companies that really isn't targeted towards identity theft. Certainly could include information regarding individuals, but many times this is going to be an attack that is focused on really gathering information to use in a competitive way. That certainly could be a state-sponsored actor, and we've certainly seen that. It could be private sector attacking the private sector, but typically drawing this distinction, obviously there could be cyber espionage that is related to an intelligence function. I would probably put that more under the cyber war type attack. Here I would say this is more of a private sector threat vector, though you could consider attacks on the intelligence community to be cyber espionage as well. Which really takes us to a new phrase we've heard now in the U.S. related to the recent attacks that we've seen that are linked to state-sponsored actors, according to the United States government, and that is cyber vandalism. It's a term that obviously is a bit new for many of us, and I think it's a term that tries to draw a distinction between some of these purely state-sponsored attacks that are focused on, we'll say, a military or intelligence target, and perhaps a state-sponsored attack that doesn't attack public sector to public sector. I think the challenge of this term is that obviously with the recent attacks on Sony, you do see threats of a 9/11 type attack in movie theaters. You also really see an attack on our fundamental freedoms in the United States about what movies will be, may or may not be released here. So I think while it's an interesting term, obviously the cyber vandalism term may be just a different way to characterize other threats that may be, frankly, serious to our and an issue for our country in a variety of ways. And so as we look at these categories, obviously they don't have import per se, but I think it does tee up how you respond in a variety of other issues, which we'll talk about now. So if we do draw these lines, how are these different, and then how do we respond differently? And you've seen that issue begun to be debated in the United States. Obviously, some are targeted much more towards the public sector versus the private sector, both from a target as well as the person that is engaging in the attack. The amount of resources may be vastly different. If it is a nation state taking certain actions, they may have more resources than a private sector hacker, though that may not be the case in the case of some very organized cyber crime rings. The nature of the claims that may be brought, to the extent that civil claims are relevant in this, obviously that is a potential remedy against certainly the private sector. The public sector has issues that may create some problems with those kind of claims, but obviously we see from the fourth bullet point, obviously with nation states, there's diplomacy and sanctions that can be brought to bear in those cases. So there are certain other civil, if you will, type of sanctions or claims that can be made when it is a public sector actor, assuming you can get to the fifth bullet point, which is attribution. And you can see with the recent developments, there's certainly the U.S. feels sufficient really information after putting a lot of resources on it to attribute it to certain nation states. Obviously, those claims have been denied by the nation states in question. So you have always the issue of attribution. And frankly, it really tees up the last bullet point here, which is what's the response? And for the public sector in the United States, they have certain abilities to respond, perhaps in kind, and that the private sector either doesn't have or may be more limited in. And so there's a lot of debate about hacking back in the United States, and there's a lot of issues that really are difficult to deal with in that context. One is attribution. Obviously, the amount of resources in many cases, if it is a nation state, they have a much more dedicated cyber capability than many private sector companies. And there's the thing you see, frankly, that the administration is talking about now, which is proportionality. And I think this is where the issue of how we characterize the type of attack really does tee into a very critical point, which is what is proportional, and does that proportionality drive a different response if we characterize certain actions as cyber war versus cyber crime versus our new phrase, cyber vandalism. And I think that's obviously a key issue that should be and probably will be debated going forward, is when we do see these types of attacks, both on the public sector and the private sector, what is the appropriate response, given that we are, frankly, dealing with a lot of these issues, and we'll be dealing with it, I think, much more so going forward as we see cyber become much more of an issue for every company and, frankly, every country. So an issue we'll certainly be dealing with a lot at the Lares Institute, and I appreciate everyone tuning in for this CyberSide Chat.